President of the United States has certain powers vested in him by the Constitution. These range from a legislative role, like the ability to sign bills into law and veto congressional legislation, to executive powers, including those of war and foreign affairs, where the President acts as the Commander-in-Chief and appoints ambassadors. However, the presidential office has been growing in authority since its creation and has taken to assume powers and duties not explicitly given to it. We will discuss four main presidents who have defined this upward trend in expanding the powers of the executive branch, beginning with Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson is widely regarded as the president who laid the foundations for the office and set the standards for the very perception of the presidency. As the first president not from an aristocratic background, Jackson sought to promote the idea of the presidency as a direct representative of the common people. He expanded executive power in pursuit of such ends, implementing such practices as rotation in office or term limits. Jackson also expanded presidential power so dramatically and crushed opposition so ruthlessly that he was often referred to as King Andrew. We see this first in the Bank War, where Jackson wielded the veto power with impunity to destroy the national bank, actions which later forced the Senate to censure Jackson. Again, in the nullification crisis, where South Carolina threatened secession, Jackson went out of his way to interpret the Constitution and enforce laws independently, exemplified through the passage of the Force Bill, which gave him authorization to use any force necessary to put down Southern dissent. However, perhaps the best representation of Jackson's expansion of executive power comes from his blatant disregard of Supreme Court rulings against his forceful policy of Indian removal. For example, in response to the ruling Worcester v. Georgia, Jackson is popularly quoted as saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it."
Next, we have our 16th President, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln greatly expanded presidential powers by passing crucial legislation such as the Emancipation Proclamation and making executive decisions for troop placements and the appointment of generals. In the third year of the Civil War, Lincoln wrote and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. In essence, this document called for the immediate liberation of all slaves in the Confederacy and was viewed as being on the same level as a law. While the traditional process is to have a law proposed by and agreed upon by both houses of the Congress and signed into effect by the President, Lincoln greatly increased the powers of the President by making a bold statement and circumventing processes that would normally be reserved for Congress. Furthermore, at the time, the most powerful branch of the government was Congress. It had the power, among others, to tax, withhold revenues, declare war, and make laws. Yet Lincoln deliberately prevented Congress from adjourning for several months following the events of Fort Sumter so that he could continue to utilize executive orders and thus work around Congress's job. Lincoln expanded upon the president's war powers and the role of the president in making public statements that reflected his position on topics and the steps he would take.
Roosevelt believed that the president could assume power over anything not explicitly banned by law or the Constitution. During the second half of the 1800s, Congress was the most powerful branch of government, and they typically gave large businesses full freedom to do anything to accomplish their goals. Its passive stance influenced Teddy Roosevelt to believe that the government had the right and the responsibility to regulate big business so that its actions did not negatively affect the general public. He ordered the United States Justice Department to file a lawsuit against the Northern Securities Company, a railroad monopoly which ended up dissolving the trust. He was the first president to implement trust-busting policies towards harmful business, setting a precedent for future policy. His ability to collaborate with Congress was unparalleled, marked with great efficiency. Teddy Roosevelt's most significant contribution to the expansion of presidential powers was through foreign policy. As president, he lifted the United States out of isolationist policies and revolutionized foreign affairs. He drastically extended his constitutional powers with his involvement in Latin America, working closely with Congress to sort out legislation. He believed that the United States had the global responsibility and that a strong foreign policy served the country's national interests.
We finally have Franklin D. Roosevelt, president from 1933 to 1945, who expanded the powers of the president that allowed him to be more authoritative. He ushered Congress to pass a record 15 bills in the first 100 days of his presidency aimed toward economic recovery, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Tennessee Valley Authority. In his second term, Roosevelt tried to appoint 6 new justices in his favor due to the Supreme Court's initial opposition to his New Deal program. Congress shot down his court packing scheme, but nevertheless by 1941, the court's behavior did change in favor of his policies. Further, Roosevelt was active in the Senate and House primaries with the goal of quote-unquote purging the Democratic Party of conservative Democrats who were opposed to his New Deal program. Roosevelt's campaign was unsuccessful, but again, much like what happened to the Supreme Court, Congress became more willing to pass bills pertaining to governmental reorganization. In 1939, Roosevelt managed to persuade Congress to pass the Reorganization Act, which allowed Roosevelt to rearrange many executive agencies under his administration's control, such as the Bureau of the Budget, which was originally part of the Department of Treasury, and created the Executive Office. The Executive Office consists of many experts in various fields and staff that reports immediately to the President of the United States, and increased the size of the White House staff since 1939. Roosevelt enacted many policies that increased the powers of the President in a time of great economic depression. His policies were so favorable that he was elected a record 4 times to the presidency, thus prompting the 25th Amendment, which set the term limit of future presidents. He and his New Deal policies served as a template for future activist presidents and created a larger president-led governmental presence in his citizens' lives, becoming the influence for future domestic programs such as LBJ's Great Society program.